Hi, everybody, and good morning. It's so good to see you and to meet you here in the ether. And I feel like I want to start this conversation by asking each of you first to just introduce yourselves briefly, but more to get to where you were when you understood that the world was about to change, that the arts were, things were shutting down, that in fact, your work was about to change, and the work of several or all of the people that you normally cover and write about was changing in real time. Tell us, let's start there. Anyone can jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in. My name's Jason Farago. I'm a critic at large for the New York Times. I'm really happy to be here. I'm here in New York. And at the beginning of 2020, I was doing what I usually do, which is flying a little too much and moving a little too much. In January, went to Singapore to give a talk and came home via Taipei. And I remember in Taipei, in the Republic of China, as opposed to the People's Republic of China, there were already these rumblings about something happening in Wuhan. I remember when I got to the airport, going through a sort of giant thermometer in the shape of a metal detector and having a kind of scan done of myself. Wow. I remember very well the end of January getting on the flight back to New York, and the majority Taiwanese passengers on the airplane were basically entirely wearing face masks. I was probably the only one who wasn't. And by February, I had gone to London. I came back from London on a plane that was about 85 or 90% empty, and told myself, well, this is going to be great. I'm going to be able to fly without any hassle at the airport. This virus doesn't sound that bad in the first place. By early March, it was the opening of the Gerhard Richter show at the Met Breuer, the last show that took place there. I have very distinct memories of washing my hands as I went downstairs to the bathroom and air kissing from a somewhat over-the-top distance at the opening, but still thinking that this was somehow going to be, at the absolute worst, a kind of 1 month to 45 days situation. And that sort of first to second week of March was when I knew something really serious was going to happen. And we can talk about this a little bit later, but all of that motion and all of that movement, all of that circulation was so fundamental to how I thought about art and how I thought about culture. And the kind of stasis that was imposed on us in mid-March came as a real, not only as a sort of personal shock, but as an aesthetic shock as well.
Well, I'm Anne Midgette. I'm the former classical music critic of the Washington Post, now a freelance writer. And it's funny what you say, Jason, because we had tickets to Glenstone, the private art museum, on the Thursday before the world shut down. And it was already pretty empty, and we were wandering around, and it really was like this farewell. There was this sense of a valedictory, and we knew there was a shutdown coming. We didn't know how long. And we have a child in the 3rd grade, so the shutdown, we were those parents who were dealing with remote schooling and all of that. But I was in a very funny position for this shutdown because I quit my job in November of 2019. One of my colleagues at another paper said I was like a Trump cabinet member who dumped all the stocks before they went toxic. I got out just in time. I said, what did you know that we didn't know? So I knew that this year was going to be hugely different for me, that I was going to be working at home, that I was saying goodbye to all the movement, that I wanted to sort of focus on my own work, and that this was going to be a huge change, not going out all the time, not traveling all the time. What I didn't know is that the rest of the world would obligingly do this along with me. I really didn't mean to take everybody along. And what this led to, oddly, I thought it was going to be this huge step away from my career. But I've kind of stayed in my career since everything is done by Zoom. I'm not reviewing anymore, but then nobody's reviewing anymore. And these conversations that have been happening on Zoom have been really interesting, and I've been thrilled to be a part of them. It's a very odd vantage point, and it's very odd looking now at what's going to happen when the world goes back. But in April, shortly after the shutdown, Vanity Fair got in touch with me and asked if I'd do a piece for their website on the shutdown. And at that point, we're about a month into it. And we're starting to realize this may go longer than a month. Maybe it was 5 or 6 weeks by the time it ran. And I got to talk to a lot of people in their first phases of rejiggering, refocusing their efforts, sort of going into second gear for what did become the long haul. And I felt like that piece came at a really interesting time for me to give me this perspective on how it was going from my sort of odd vantage point where I'm not really affiliated with an institution anymore either.
Maya, where were you?
I was in my office at the New York Review of Books. I'm an editor there right now. And unlike Anne and Jason, I'm not a writer myself. I'm not someone who is ever, traveling from place to place covering things. So my experience of it kind of feels like it came a little bit later. I mean, we had been functioning as we always have been. All of the editors, we would come into the office every day to put the magazine out. I think maybe in February, our technical director started talking about, what might we do if we had to go remote? And I think for myself and probably for the other editors, there are like 12 or 13 of us, we were all like, oh, that would never happen. How could we possibly put out this magazine remotely? Because, we're pretty traditional in a lot of ways. We're quite analog. We do everything. Some of the editors were still editing by hand before we went remote. So that was kind of just a huge shift for us. And it's funny you mentioned the Richter show, because I remember one of our contributors was covering it. And this was kind of right when this was all happening. And our process, I think it's pretty unique. I've never worked at another magazine, but for us, we get all the books sent into the office. We open them by hand. We stack them on all our shelves. We hand them to each other. And then when we put the magazine out, we print everything out and we have things read in sort of 2 or 3 rounds by hand. And I remember saying to my colleagues, like, there's just no way. How are we going to do this remotely? But in February, my colleague Mike, who does kind of the tech stuff, started putting things onto a server, teaching us how to use it. And I think it was all just incredibly overwhelming. And it really happened so fast. By the second week of March, I think it was maybe a Wednesday or a Thursday, our publisher said, okay, we're going to go remote. We'll probably see you in a couple of months. And then we went totally remote, and, it was a huge adjustment for us, but yeah.
What about the artists that you all have relationships with? One of the things that happened with me, I performed with Toshi Regan at Royce Hall at UCLA. And I remember we must have been there around the 8th or the 9th of March. And we didn't know whether or not anyone was going to come to the show, because they had already put up on their website, if you don't feel comfortable coming, we completely understand. Tickets are refundable. And we were prepared to not perform. And then that time came and we walked out, and there was an ass in every seat. There were 1,800 people in Royce Hall. And it also felt like, well, if we're going to go out, if this is it, this is the way to go out. And as a performer, I can't think of a better way for me to have said goodbye to a kind of way of life. But then when I got home, I was really confused, because in LA, people are in cars. It's so much more spread out. And I'm here in New York, and there were still people on the subway, but none of my friends would meet me anywhere. My people here, no one would hug me. No one would go. And I said, but what are you doing? And they were already in survival mode. you got to get your head out of the clouds and get to the supermarket and buy food for 2 weeks. I was like, okay, for 2 weeks, but why are you like this?
Right.
And then slowly I went into a kind of shock. And not only was I watching all of my work disappear, so many of my friends were watching their work disappear. So many of them were not equipped with savings, with health insurance, with very, very fundamental things that we all need to feel safe, even if the world around us is changing exponentially. So what was it like for you to be in touch with people you review? I imagine that some of them are also your friends, writers that you have relationships with, Maya. What were they saying to you, and how were you understanding that what you were doing was also about to change?
Well, my main focus in classical music has been opera, and of course, classical music and opera are among the fields most devastated by this event. And I felt myself to be very much in two places, because I feel like anything I say about the silver linings seems to denigrate the absolute devastation of what's happened. And in opera in particular, there's no protection. Even the biggest opera stars, nobody has a full-time job. Everybody's paying their own health insurance. The Metropolitan Opera doesn't give you a full-time contract. So the people at the very top of their careers, musicians, pianists and violinists, as well as singers, were wiped out. And, the bigger your salary, the more you're wiped out. You may be supporting other family members. You may be paying a mortgage. You may have finally paid off all those years of debt. And that was really alarming. On the other hand, the big institutions, which are the financial network of the performing arts, are so riddled with problems, particularly, I think, orchestras, operas. There's so much that needs to change on so many levels. And I've been desperately hoping that COVID is a wake-up call for some of the social change that we really, really, really need to see in this field, while at the same time feeling heartsick for all the people who are looking at their livelihoods wiped out, the people who have had to give up, who've had to move, who've had to change careers, and there are a lot of them. And it's really going to be alarming when the smoke clears.
We're going to get to that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, just quickly, I grew up kind of around here, and the other day I walked to Lincoln
Around
Center.
here? Where's here?
I'm on the Upper West Side in New York right now. And, Lincoln Center was just such a huge part of my life when I was a child. And it's so striking to see that life seems to be going back to normal for a lot of people. And for us, we work with writers who review books. So not so much has changed. There's still, writers are still writing, books are still being published, and we're still reviewing. But I walked by Lincoln Center the other day, and it's just as dark as it was a year ago. So that's just incredibly heartbreaking and very striking. And I think it will, I just have no idea what's going to happen going forward.
What I wanted to add was, first the sort of uncertainty, Helga, that you were describing in the sort of middle of March about sort of what are the rules of performing, and then what are the rules of sort of socialization afterwards. Although this was a novel coronavirus, and therefore you should have at least a little bit of sympathy for the public health authorities for not giving us extremely clear directions, I think it's really important to say, that we were failed in a pretty serious way by the federal government, and indeed by state and local governments, depending on where you're from, in terms of giving clear indications. I have particular memories in the middle of March of the New York government trying to get people into Broadway seats, and a famous have your last drink at the bars in order to have a good goodbye to everybody, which was not the case in San Francisco or in Seattle. This is a situation that played out differently in different cities. The other thing I want to remember about last March is that the markets tanked at around the same time. And particularly for people of my generation, I think there was a a sense of deja vu, a sense that what we were about to live through was 2008 all over again. And in the art world in particular, there was a kind of assumption that everybody was about to get wiped out, right? That the rich and the poor alike were about to go through another form, another second lesser depression, another financial crisis. We now know, of course, that we did not live through a financial crisis. We are still living through a health crisis. It's a very different phenomenon in both economic and in social terms. And by the summer, I'd say, by June, when it was pretty clear that the people who support art museums, orchestras, and other significant nonprofits were not going to have the massive hit to their bottom line that they did in 2008 and 2009. And yet, the people who are on the stages or who are in the galleries are taking a hit even more substantial than they took in 2008, 2009. That was a really significant wake-up call for me, because it turned out that the languages that I had forged around 08, 09 and the kind of reflexes that the financial crisis had instilled in me were actually not fit for purpose, and that we were going to be living through something substantially different from what we lived through in 08, 09. So that sort of transition from March to, I guess, May and June, and of course a moment that also coincides with the now convicted murder of George Floyd and the social uprisings that came along with it in June, that really did sort of form my own sense of how the arts have to sort of get out of this. That this is not simply a question about people's bottom lines, but about much more fundamental reforms of what kind of cultural apparatus we want to have in this country and in this city.
If I could just jump in, I feel like we have people are so convinced that they need this system of these institutions, they've become synonymous with art in people's minds. You have to have a big museum, you have to have a big opera house, you have to have a big orchestra to hear this music or to see this art. And in fact, there are so many other ways to do it. And COVID has shown there are many other ways to do it. The fear is, however, that our default at this point is to return to the comfort of these large institutions because they're so well established and entrenched. They end up sucking dollars out of the ether, and they suck creativity out too. Everything becomes much more regimented and less creative. And as Jason said, this is a much bigger problem than a COVID problem. And exactly the fact that the artists are suffering so badly when the patrons are doing just fine is another example of how the institutions are just broken. Most of the institutions are broken, in my opinion.
I couldn't wait to share this experience I had last night with you today. I have been, my not traveling and my not doing my work for a year has been completely devastating for me personally. And I just can say that to you because we're right here talking about it. And this thing of the cultural institution, when I hear people say we need to go back to normal, I think of this thing of the cultural institution being the gatekeeper of opportunity or lack of opportunity for so many people, right? So last night, so I live in Harlem, and last night, one of my very good friends and mentors, Craig Harris, had a series in a church just a few blocks from where I am, a jazz series. So I would argue with you, Anne, that the people hurt more or equally badly in this situation are the opera people and the classical musicians and the jazz musicians. And so I arrived at this church, and he's been doing this series in this church for 7 years. It's on Tuesdays and Fridays. And they hadn't been gathering in the same way because of COVID. But last night was one of the first nights back. There were maybe 30 people there, everyone spaced out in the church. The tickets were $20. And for 2 hours, Craig, who is a trombonist, and so there was trombone, bass, keyboards, Carla Cook on vocals and drums. Played for 2 hours. In the audience I made 15 new friends. And the other people I knew because they'd seen me perform with Craig before. And at about 10 minutes to 9, they start to play this other piece of music of Craig's. And Craig says, "Helga, come on up here."
Wow.
And I look and I said, "Craig, people are trying to go home." He said, "Get up here." And so I ran up to that mic and I pulled my face mask down and, for 24 bars, just let it go. And I put my mask back up and I just wept. Because all of this is in me and it's waiting to be shared, whether it's with 1,800 people in Royce Hall or 30 people in a church 2 blocks from my house.
Yeah.
It's the same for me. And that we don't have systems to support both 1,800 people in Royce Hall and 30 people in a church in Harlem is wrong on every level. And so let's talk about that and go. While I try and pull myself together here.
Well, I have to say that when I said opera and musicians, of course, jazz, of course, dancers, of course, actors, everybody in performing arts has been devastated by this.
Including all technicians, the people who are not artists, people who work inside arts institutions. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But what you say is one of the problems with the big institutions is that, and I encountered this as a newspaper reporter too, you're supposed to cover the big things. Where the grassroots stuff, that's where the heart, big orchestras worry about outreach. How do we reach the community? Then you have all of these grassroots groups, small chamber groups, jazz groups in a church, small theater groups in a basement. And that's where you're building community. That's where you're building a true passionate love, far more than seeing somebody from the back of Carnegie Hall with 2,000 other people. When you're in an audience of 30 people, you get a physical immediacy, and that's a way to build a love of the art. And the fact that we have these big institutions cut off from it and leaving these small places economically adrift and then wondering how to build our audience for it. It's like a plant cutting off its roots and then trying to make the leaves grow. And this is not a COVID problem. The funny thing is that COVID has spotlighted it, and COVID can be a scapegoat. And if COVID can be a scapegoat to develop more different ways of reaching more people or supporting smaller institutions, I'm all for it. I'm worried, though, that COVID may become a reason that fewer people get the funding and that the grassroots dies out faster. And time will really tell.
Yeah. This is, a little adjacent to what you're saying in terms of the performing arts, but I was just talking to one of our writers yesterday, Ingrid Rowland, who writes about art and architecture, and she's based in Rome. And she was telling me that the museums in Rome, when she was a student and a young professor years ago, the museums just had a completely different energy. They were much more intimate. She would go and she'd be able to spend time in a gallery and really forge a bond both with the art itself and with the other people kind of in the room. And this kind of reminds me of what you were saying, Helga, about making 15 new friends at that church in Harlem. And I think, like she was saying to me yesterday, that the museums, at least in Italy, are really realizing that the old system of mass tourism, while lucrative, needs to change, because there is just no opportunity anymore for a student or a young professor or anyone really to form these bonds. For Ingrid, they've been life-changing and they've kind of become her life, just kind of sitting in front of a work of art. And I think that's something she said that people have realized needs to change as well from COVID in terms of the arts. Yeah.
You know, Helga, the story that you were telling us earlier was a kind of clarification or an intensification maybe of something that I've been feeling quite a bit lately. And again, like Anne, I don't like to speak in the language of silver linings, but I do appreciate the discovery this year of what we could live without and what we could not live without. Mm-hmm. And the words like essential or words like unmissable turned out to be pretty inaccurate by the end of last March. And it turns out that there are lots of things we could do without. And then there were others that we could not. And I think that it behooves us going forward to try to build systems, or at the very least to build a language to describe systems that can ensure the kind of things we cannot live without, the kind of performances and the kind of communities and intimacy that we cannot live without. One thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit is, you know, it's very easy and, in my view, entirely valid to say sort of, you know, beware the big institutions, let's all sort of come together. That's great. How? In what form? Under what aegis? And in particular, I've been very interested in how in France, which is a place I know well because my husband is French, the system of what they call intermittence, irregularity for performers, is a tax regime that can enable the kind of promiscuity between larger and smaller, between more and less intimate sort of forms of performance and art. The way it works basically is that artists, and not just artists, also technicians, people who work in the performing arts, log their hours. And if you get over X hours a year, then you qualify in the eyes of the finance ministry as a professional artist, a professional performer or technician or whatever it is. And that means that you're still getting paid by whether it's the Paris Opera Company or the tiny little church quartet, whatever it is, on the weeks that you are performing. But on the weeks that you are not, you have now qualified for a particular kind of artistic unemployment insurance. And that's also retirement benefits, that's maternity leave, et cetera, et cetera. And what this system understands is that artists and the rest of these people are not simply artists. They are also workers. They are people who have a contribution to make to not just the culture, but to the economy. And therefore, they have to be supported as such, they have to be taxed as such, and they have to be given benefits as such. And this, I think, is one valuable thing that came out of the last government. I never, ever, ever thought that Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump would put their names to the largest benefits for people who are irregularly employed, who get 1099 income that this country has ever seen. And yet the CARES Act did it. It's called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA. It was renewed in the December stimulus package. And I hope that Janet Yellen and the government, the Biden administration, capitalizes on it going forward, because what it did is it said that people who are gig workers, which includes very many of the people who make the culture that we care about in this country, are workers, and therefore need to be supported with unemployment insurance and other forms of benefits as such. So when I think about how going forward, you know, it would be wonderful if every jazz quartet and every little dance program could have their own munificent billionaire to go along with it. But in the absence of that, thinking about the kind of economic or the kind of financial systems that we ought to be advocating for in order to ensure that a singer or that a technician can build the kind of career in the medium to long term that would allow them to perform for just 10 or 15 minutes in a church. That, for me, is the sort of real hope that I have going forward.
But can we really have this conversation without talking about race and without talking about class and what's invested in certain parts of our There are people who I feel who they want to go to the opera and only see people who look like themselves. They're not interested in sharing that space. It's built into our ideas of what's better and who this is for. And well, no, not everyone can have access or should have access to this, regardless of the fact that it benefits all of us. I don't think that we can get away from that conversation anymore, because I hear what you're saying, Jason. I hear what you're all saying. And I want to be on the bus, except that when I was growing up and playing Beethoven and Mozart and Liszt horribly on the piano, I didn't know that white people played classical music until I got to Carnegie Hall. And then I didn't understand where all the Black people were. So where is that in this conversation too?
That is, when I say that institutions are broken, that is the other huge piece of it, certainly in my field. Classical music, these institutions are so built around protecting the tradition, which for many listeners turns out, which is code, threatened terribly by the whole idea of diversity. You know, oh my God, bring in some Black composers and you get immediately this thing of, oh, it's a meritocracy and Mozart is great. I mean, I always say, if you walked into a bookstore and held up every new book and said, is it as good as Shakespeare, people would laugh at you. But in classical music, it becomes this thing right away. It's not as good as Mozart. We don't need to listen to this. But also that institutional outreach, it's incredibly codified. There's this kind of colonizing belief that underlies it, that we will benefit people in lower income areas if we play our better music for them. And it's wildly offensive, and it underlies a lot of educational programs that people are fighting for very valiantly, and it needs to break, it needs to end. And one of the great ironies, silver linings, call it what you will, a lot of these institutions have been waking up to the idea that, oh, oops, we need to be a little more racially sensitive. It's going to be a slow process. We're going to name a task force. And I've been saying for a while, no, you just hire more Black people. It's really not that hard. In the wake of the George Floyd murder, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and in the wake of all of these shutdowns that have spawned a lot of video productions and smaller scale things, all of a sudden it seems it doesn't take a task force or 5 years. I've seen a lot more Black artists in my field again, and it's still not enough, but a lot more focus, a lot more commissions, a lot more embrace, particularly of younger Black artists, artists of color, female artists. The irony being then that, again, this is particular to my field and particular to Black artists. Some of the elder statesmen of Black composers are getting overlooked because they're part of the existing system and we need to throw the baby out. We need to get all new. And so there's a big focus on talented 25-year-old people of color. And there's a lot of elder statesmen. I mean, Anthony Davis won the Pulitzer Prize last year and he's still not getting celebrated to the degree that every Pulitzer, not every, but many Pulitzer Prize winners have been celebrated. And there's a terrible irony for Adolphus Hailstork, Anthony Davis, these really important composers who are still not getting a place at the table. It's great that people like Jesse Montgomery are. Anyway, I feel that this is another reason that classical music really would be well served. And while appreciating what you say, Jason, that we don't want to just be facile about, oh, get rid of the institutions, they are our economic underpinnings, it's a big problem. And I wish I could look as optimistically as you, Jason, to the government solution, but I think that in America, it's going to be a long, hard slog. As much as we say there's all kinds of reasonable solutions proposed on a governmental level, but I don't see it changing in the near future. Although, as you say, the CARES Act is a step in
well,
the
let
right.
me just clarify. When I say governmental, I actually mean much more on the sort of treasury side than on the culture ministry side. I don't believe that a kind of NEA Mark II of sort of 90s style individual grants is going to happen again, nor am I necessarily convinced that it would be the best path forward. I do believe that there are direct ways that tax code and other more instrumental things can change to make things better. But to go to your question about diversity institutions, in the art world, things are a little bit different simply because of the big bad market. Because philanthropy is at best on a parallel track, at worst basically congruent with a kind of market impulse. the very real diversification of who is on the walls of our museums that has happened and has accelerated over the last year has nevertheless also been accompanied by well, to use a very vulgar word, a feeding frenzy among certain kinds of collectors who don't necessarily look like the artists in question for the next big thing. And if some of these collectors are wonderful people who have all the right ethics and want to do everything in their power to build a better society, not all of them are. And I think that it is, how to say this? The single worst outcome I could possibly imagine for our institutions now is a kind of what I would call a kind of Netflix diversity, in which you, in which you have a kind of performative boardroom level operation in which, you know, you underestimate the fact that all people have the not only the legitimacy but the ability to be the best possible artists around, and you end up doing a kind of patronizing, market-driven, metrics-driven response. And I think that there is among a kind of white board member class a real fear of not only of basically letting people of color run the show, as opposed to saying, look what a good person I am because I have this report that McKinsey gave me to say that I have improved the number of people who don't look like me from X% to Y%. And I think that's really something that has to be resisted. I think that, you know, people of color are here to be treated in the plenitude of their artistic abilities and in the plenitude of their human capacities. And if a few places are doing that, not all of them are. And I really think it is important that all of them do.
Yeah, I mean, in books too, it seems like there definitely was kind of, you know, a reckoning and awakening, whatever you want to call it, after last May and June and the summer and all the protests. And I think, I mean, there are some publishers who are doing such good work and so much work to bring diversity, you know, to the table. But I think it's been really hard, especially in the past year. And I think part of it has to do, I mean, I'm a little bit adjacent to the book industry because we review the books, but I don't know that much about, you know, kind of the publishing market. But I think it's been so much harder for the newer authors over this past year, many of whom are diverse, to get their books in front of people's faces. I mean, people are always talking about Amazon, but obviously everyone's been buying their books online this year. And you don't have the kind of bookstore experience where you might discover a new author, or you might discover a new subject. And I think, like, I don't know, a friend put it the other day, interestingly, like COVID has kind of favored the incumbents, like the older established white male authors who everyone is kind of already familiar with, and they're buying their books. And I think it's been just that much harder. And obviously people, I mean, I think we probably all read, like, last summer, everyone was buying books, you know, like how to be an anti-racist, like things like that. But
not supposed to be funny.
There are also, you know, books by Black authors, books by other authors of color that aren't about race. And, like, you know, those need to be put in front of people too. And I think, like, as the publishing industry has really, you know, tried to become more diverse, I mean, not soon enough, but like over the past year, that's definitely been something I've been seeing from my side of things. I mean, the question is, like, how do we get these books in front of people with, you know, the closing of bookstores, and we haven't had author events, and, like, that's been a real shame too.
But just tangentially, because I'm outside the publishing industry, but doesn't social media play a huge role? I've read lots of books off Twitter, and then spoken on series where, like, author series. I thought that the Zoom author series was sort of a burgeoning.
I think it's been wonderful. I mean, and it's brought, I mean, geographically, anyone can show up to an author event that might have happened at, you know, McNally Jackson, Soho. And now anyone can show up. But I think it's still, you know, I think the publishing industry just still has a really long way to go. And I mean, it's also in terms of, you know, hiring diverse editors at the lower level. I think that's a big thing. I know, Jason, you were talking about, you know, the kind of, like, white board members and stuff. I mean, that's a thing in publishing too. You need to think about who is the gatekeepers of what gets published, like who's picking the book that gets picked up, the book that gets heavily promoted, because that matters too.
So how do we make this local? This was the other thing I was thinking about last night after my 24 bars of bliss. If there isn't a government intervention or a Treasury Department intervention that can allow this kind of series to continue, where's our community? Where's our local community? Where are the people? Who are the people in our neighborhoods that could help? Or what are the other models for making this happen, so that if this X or Y board doesn't want to diversify, we can say, okay, here are the people in the neighborhood or in the community that are going to support this artist or going to support this series with their, I don't know what. How isn't there? Come on, Helga. What I'm worried about is that we're going to build the same house with different materials. That's what I'm worried about. And that at the end of the day, it's going to be the same house and the same people will be favored and the same situations will be favored. And that all of this time of dismantling will have been for naught. So what other models? I loved this thing that you were talking about, the system in France, Jason. But if our government won't do it and our benevolent daddy won't do it, is there another way to do it?
Well, one possibility would be if you really believe, community is a tough word because I think we all belong to multiple communities in many different ways and many different scales. But I do think that one profitable model is to recognize that if the community members who are in your audience are also members of adjacent communities that may be formed along religious lines or along educational lines or along any, even just the local street, that there are partnerships to be fostered between artistic and non-artistic nonprofits and other organizations. I think a place that does this extremely well is the Queens Museum, which is it's right near Corona, which was one of the single most devastated neighborhoods in all of New York City in the first wave of COVID in March and early April. And the Queens Museum understands that although it does try to get people like me from Manhattan to come out and see the shows, and people from Los Angeles and people from Tokyo, I'm sure they do, nevertheless, their principal audience is right outside of their door. And in order to reach them, they don't necessarily go through a highfalutin art critic for the New York Times, but through everything from the church to the food pantry to the community college to the sort of local gardening, what do you call it? The sort of community garden in the neighborhood. Yeah. And those kind of partnerships require a certain lack of pretension, a certain willingness to listen and not simply to deliver. We were talking about sort of better and worse forms of diversity. I'm very, very concerned about the institution that says, I want to do the exact same thing that I've always been doing before, and I want it to be a more diverse version of that. I think that's a terrible model. Right? And I think that a place like the Queens Museum does offer a particularly interesting way where the cultural institution sort of strengthens itself by weakening itself. It takes a step back in order to take two steps forward. And that by bringing in other community actors, bringing in people outside of their own realm of expertise, they not only are able to reach an audience that they wouldn't necessarily reach before, but they end up doing better programming themselves at the same time. So those kind of cross-disciplinary partnerships, I think, would be one way to begin.
It's my hope that in the wake of COVID, those things have been taking off more. I know institutions that certainly talk the talk. The Shed was trying to reach out. I don't know. The Shed has been cut off in New York City by COVID, obviously. I'm not sure what they're able to do now, but they were talking about trying to reach different kinds of local institutions. I know Washington Performing Arts in DC has an urban arts initiative that is looking for smaller groups, because it's a myth to think that the community that wants to hear jazz in Harlem is different from the community that wants to go to jazz at Lincoln Center. That could be the same people. And I mean, jazz at Lincoln Center may be a bad example, but you know, for all the various reasons, if the large institutions really are interested in reaching out and building, you know, relationships with smaller institutions, there's a lot that can be done, because one of the big problems with the large institutions is they focus all the donors and make the donors think they need all the money rather than sort of seed the community. I don't know how well Carnegie Hall's New York festivals have gone. I think they've also made an effort to sort of reach outside the institution. And again, I haven't been in New York to cover the aftermath, but there's been a lot of different kinds of representation and off-site presentations. That's the beginning of something good. Something we haven't raised that's been a big feature of COVID, and Helga, you probably were going to ask this, but I'm interested to ask you as a performer, is the role of the digital presentation performance. It's been such a feature of COVID, and it was sort of the great white hope of COVID. And I've seen some fabulously innovative things that have allowed small companies to do great stuff. I've seen a lot of crap. I've seen a lot of, there's been trying to monetize that and trying to get eyeballs on it is a whole nother animal. But I'm curious what you guys think about that as another avenue for the future.
I mean, I think it probably is an avenue for the future. But for me, 24 bars for 30 people, and I can't get away from it. And I will do whatever. Well, that's not quite true, but I will do a lot of things in order to bring the work that I'm doing in front of people. I was very fortunate that right when I was, when I was still in shock, Paola Prestini, who is a composer I work with a lot and who is a friend, pulled me into having artist talks as part of National Sawdust started a digital discovery series. And what was nice is that someone gave some money to the organization, and they were able to pay 100 artists $1,000 and commission a new work. And it was a huge thing for those artists who were very much in need. And so these are the kinds of micro things that I think have been amazing for us. I'm also wanting to ask you too, does it mean though that you, Jason and Anne, have a series that's not the shiny review, the review of the shiny thing, where you have 10 things that you go and see that are in Queens or in whatever those small parts of where you are, and that because a review from you means something for those artists and for those communities who are trying to get seen.
And possibly means even more given the fact that the state of media is not so different from the state of culture in some ways. I mean, I grew up reading The Village Voice when I wanted to be a young critic. The Village Voice is no more. LA Weekly is the same deal. The digital formats, digital publications have made up a fraction of the difference, but not anything resembling the kind of cultural ecosystem that came before. Even the New York Times, certainly when it came to classical music, when it came to theater, had a kind of obligation or a self-imposed obligation to review just about everything that opened, and we don't do that anymore. I think it's great that we don't do that, but it behooves us to make sure that each week there is a diversity not only of participants, but of locations and of scales and of styles that not only represents the kind of cultural offering on offer in general, but that also gives to readers a fairer and a fuller sense of what the sort of cultural ferment is of our time. On the subject of local versus sort of large scale, I do just want to say, and this has been a sort of rolling disappointment I have with digital media since I've been young is that every time I'm told, you know, the barriers are falling, the gatekeepers are no more, it turns out that everybody is going to have an equal voice. The most recent one is with something called NFTs, which is a kind of environmentally destructive, monstrous Bitcoin thing that allows you to make cartoons and sell them for millions of dollars. This never happens, right? Like, guess what? The institutions are us. It doesn't seem that the problem is in our code. It is in ourselves. And the idea that, you know, not only does the person in Manhattan find it difficult to get out of his or her apartment and get to the performance in Queens, this person won't even go on the internet and listen to the musician from Bamako or the writer from Jakarta that the digital revolution had promised us in the first place. That it turns out almost to have been the worst of both worlds. That it simultaneously devastated the kind of local engagement that you're describing in this small church performance, and nevertheless doesn't even seem to have created the kind of global village that we had been promised with sort of round one of the digital formation. How do we do that? How do you break up? I mean, finding manners to evade sort of algorithmic homogeneity has been sort of one of my principal engagements as a critic, and I think is important for artists and other cultural producers to think about as well. Because if the collaborator from Bamako or Jakarta is only a click away, as is the collaborator from down the hall, why are we not reaching either of them? Seems to me to be a question we haven't really answered.
But I think we are. I think that YouTube, you know, YouTube follows a whole different logic from us cultural opinion makers, even whether you want to call us gatekeepers or gate followers or whatever. And you look at what's popular on YouTube, and many critics, including me, will tell you, well, that's not really good, but it has 5 gajillion hits. I mean, newspapers are caught in this very funny thing because, as you say, we're in the same position as these institutions because the problems we're talking about are not unique to the arts. They're unique to institutions in the 21st century. Like, oh my goodness, we can't do things the way we've always done. We're losing audiences. Our audience is getting older. How do we gain new audiences? We'll go online. And then online, of course, at the Post, this was a constant thing for me because I very much wanted to cover the grassroots, and I felt the grassroots was important. And the paper was more focused on an online audience, which is the national audience, which literally will not click and read about a local performance. But in the print paper, the print readers will actually read about the local performance. But since it doesn't get as many hits online, the review is not as important. Or if you run the review online only, the print audience isn't going to see it. And it's a real catch-22 of how to be fair to the local, which I felt was a huge part of my mandate as a critic in a paper that, unlike the papers in New York, fulfilled the role of both the Daily News and the New York Times. The Washington Post has been a local and a national paper. And there's no solution to it. My predecessors have struggled with it. I know my successor struggles with it. But it's a problem with the digital climate in general that, you know, the digital world is very well set up to be the local watering hole, but we always think nationally with it. But I do think that YouTube allows a flowering of special interest, that there's lots of kind of funky stuff in Jakarta. Or I have a Twitter friend who's an expert on Chinese opera, and he's always posting these snippets of YouTube things of regional Chinese opera companies. I've learned more from him. And it's a specialized interest, sure, but so is Western opera. So we're all operas. And I'm not seeing the problem. The problem is getting our readers, the Washington Post reader, the New York Times reader, may not click on that link because they're not going to do what we want either. But I fear, you know, for better or worse, more and more people are freeing themselves of the tyranny of the press altogether. I will say that my husband, who used to write for the Village Voice, teaches a course at Juilliard, which used to be called music criticism. And his enrollment began falling off, and he realized it's because nobody read music criticism. They changed the title to something like Writing About Music, and enrollment shot up because every musician has to be able to write about music. You've got to write your audience, you've got to write your own program notes. Maybe you're going to be a critic. And so music criticism as a genre, and I think criticism as a genre, it's morphing into some other kind of thing too. So the daily papers are no longer the arbiters of sort of what is popular and what is not that we would like to be.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think. I mean, because where I work, I think we have obviously a much more niche readership than the Washington Post or the New York Times. But it still feels like such a huge responsibility to decide what gets covered and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And often, I mean, I think I said there are like, I can never remember, like 12 or 13 of us, and we're just deciding what gets 4,000 words in the paper. And that just seems like kind of an awesome responsibility. I mean, often it'll be, you know, a writer like, you know, Jason writes for us, and sometimes he'll say, oh, I'm interested in writing about this. And then we'll say, sure, go ahead. But a lot of times it's like, you know, one of my colleagues might happen to come across a book that's published by a tiny little press that no one would have known about, or, you know, a performance of Chinese opera or something that, you know, other readers might not have even thought to go to that show. But when you get that much space in kind of a magazine like this, it just makes all the difference. And it kind of just feels like it's a lot of pressure and an important job, I think.
I think it also gets us to this question. I think it's important for all of us to is you know, and you were talking about it's not that good, but it has millions of hits. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, as you, Maya, are trying to describe the sort of logic by which we determine who gets the coverage and who doesn't, I think, you know, forging a less elitist and more capacious understanding of cultural importance without ceding to the logic of the algorithms is, I think, the sort of real principal challenge that is facing a lot of us right now, right? You know, there is a, to use a vulgar word, neoliberal understanding of these things that says if it has 10 million hits or 10 million buyers, it must be better than the one that has 1 million viewers or 10 viewers. I very clearly think that's wrong, and yet the ability to prove that it's wrong through institutional prestige, through certain registers of address or certain registers of speaking is no longer available to me either, which is a good thing. It just means that we all have to clarify and all have to get a little more robust or three-dimensional about how we build languages and institutions and formats that are in which diversity and excellence sort of are understood to be self-reinforcing, as opposed to the kind of everyone's a critic model, or the this is just my opinion model, right? And how do we do that? I think that digital formats that in one way or another evade the logic of likes and shares is going to have to be one way that we do it going forward. The New York Times, I'm sort of, it's an extraordinary thing that for the first time in 150 years, the New York Times now has greater revenue from subscriptions than it does from advertising, which is an absolutely wonderful thing for, I mean, it's not as if advertising doesn't matter, but you know, the principal goal is to convince readers to spend a couple $100s a year rather than to convince advertisers. I mean, clearly they have to do both. But giving people the kind of the meatiness or the solidity to understand that, you know, you're going to learn something and you're going to meet something without falling back on the old terrible habits of the kind of voice of God institution is, I think, the sort of real goal of a lot of what we're trying to do right now. And I wouldn't pretend that there's an easy answer, nor would I pretend that there even is a finish line. But I do think that it's a sort of possibly impossible enterprise that I want to keep pushing towards.
Mm-hmm. Does the digital, another part of it we haven't talked about is, does the digital betray or lose some element of the experience? Helga, when you're speaking of singing your 24 bars, it's essential that it was in the room with the people.
Absolutely.
And it's a different animal.
And why not? Can't we have both?
Sure. Can't we have both? And I think
we have both?
Yeah. And I think that, you know, remember in the sort of round one of digital, there was this moment where like everyone's going to have a Van Gogh on their wall that they can like print out, and therefore the original Van Gogh will be worthless. That kind of naivete around what the relationship between digital and analog or digital and real life is, has pretty substantially died out in our individual lives. And yet the languages that we use to describe digital encounters with culture remains kind of stale that way. Like, is the opera that I watch on a 4-inch screen equivalent to seeing it in a 4,000 person opera house? Of course it's not, and we all know that it's not, and yet we sort of still expect certain kinds of replication or certain kinds of identity, duplication to be what the digital is supposed to offer. We toggle between high res and low res, between focus and diffusion 100 times a day in our daily lives. We switch between tabs all the time. And I think cultural institutions and artists themselves ought to be doing this. You should have one mission that is emitted through many formats, high res and low, fast and slow, permanent and fleeting, et cetera, et cetera. And that if you really know who you are and what you believe in, then I think you can relax a little bit about the actual format or the actual method of encounter. I think what we've learned with COVID and also with BLM is that a lot of these institutions actually haven't answered that question extremely well yet. That they thought that what they did was they gave people date nights, or they gave people a place to store capital, and that if they really did have a clear sense of mission, I think that discrepancy between analog and digital, or between crisp and low res, would matter a little bit less.
I have to say, I have done both things, and I'm very excited to learn about the possibilities of what it means to perform digitally. So in addition to my performance life, I also host a podcast, and I've been recording my podcast remotely. And that is not a thing a year ago that was exciting to me at all. I was actually very worried that the quality and the intimacy of the work would suffer, because now I'm in this box with this person instead of in a room across from them where I can look at them and feel them, which is, again, the experience of my 24 bars. And instead, what I'm finding is that there isn't really anything lost. It's different. But I can't honestly say that I find one to be better than the other. And that I've learned things, or sometimes you're in the middle of a conversation with someone and their camera goes out. Well, that's not the time to stop and say, your camera's gone. Now I'm just listening to a voice. And so what it has done, I think, is made me a more malleable human, which seems to be the thing that these times call for, period, across the board, whatever it is that you do.
Malleable is a good word for it, or or a potent, the ability to do different things in different times and different tempos. And I think that there's sort of, the bad version of that would be the kind of flexible worker model in which, you never get to finally settle down or build anything in the long term. But the good model is the one that you're describing, I think, in which you realize that you sort of are one person, you have one life, and yet it is expressed, or it takes different forms, not only at different times of your life, but at different times of the day, right? And that this is how not only artists, but also artistic audiences operate at this point as well. I think it does require a kind of, malleable is a very good word for it, because it means that you can kind of slip or reshape something more plastic. And, that doesn't mean giving up.
It feels good.
Yeah, does it? That's nice to hear.
It feels good. It feels good. And it means that people who don't live in New York, but who are people I would love to speak with for my podcast, I can actually speak with them.
Can I ask you a question, Helga? One thing I've been interested in about this past year has been the question about practice, about things, about rehearsals and training and staying in shape and staying current. For writers, visual artists, a little bit less, but these are people who have had the same difficulties that all of us has, but the necessarily sort of working day hasn't changed substantially. For the performing arts, the question of practice or training or rehearsal has kind of totally disappeared. And I wonder if sort of away from the stage, what has it been like? And are there things to learn going forward? I'm sorry, shouldn't have asked.
That's been one of the most difficult things. How to stay in shape.
Yeah.
First of all, I've been very, very sad. And so I've not wanted to sing. I've not had a will to sing. And that's already a disaster, because then it makes the voice less flexible. And so what I started to do was I get up every morning like 5:30, 6, and I walk. As soon as the sun, I feel the light changing on my eyes, I get up and I get dressed and I go out. And as I'm walking, I warm up.
Yeah.
And I've been singing that way.
Under your mask. Under my mask.
And it's fun because, you pass people in the street and you're like, whoa! And then where is that coming from? And so that's been good. The physical thing is also a challenge. I'm used to being in a Pilates studio or a gyrotonic studio or a yoga studio and keeping that muscle flexible. I'm in horrible shape right now and glad that I don't have to sing anything really huge and that I could leave it at 24 bars and get out before the evidence of the last year becomes apparent. But I have many friends who have been able, they sing at home, they still wake up, they have their online yoga class, they roll out their mats in their apartments, and they have stayed in shape. I'm not one of those people.
Mm-hmm. I'm also curious, Helga, kind of what the experience of performing digitally has been like too for the performer, because I know for the audience it's different. It's very different for me to watch someone singing or acting on a screen, but I'm curious for you, performing for your computer or for a camera instead of with an audience in front of you.
I've not done a lot of it. So the things that I've done digitally have been conversations. Okay. Which is very, very different than singing anything. So I've not actually done that yet. Mm. But like I said, I have many, many, many friends who are very comfortably making that transition and being able to do that. One of the things that Craig lives in a house very close to here. And so he's been holding concerts in his home. Okay. With people who are physically distant. So they've kept playing. And so that's different.
Yeah. It seems to me from people I've heard from that it has hit people in every way, from all I can do is lie under the bed and suck my thumb and I'm so miserable to I've got to do it every day. And then over the course of the 13 months, I mean, there were some people who came out of the gate. Well, Igor Levitt, the pianist, gave a live performance every day for the first 60 days. Alex Ross wrote about in the New Yorker, and then he said that's really enough. You just can't do it. And I know several people who did that, balconies in Italy or, in their home. But I spoke to one other musician who said that she completely didn't do anything. And then she pulled it together and recorded an album. She's an instrumentalist. And she felt like the album was great. And then she fell back into lassitude of like, oh my God, my whole career has been a dream and I'm going to be back to, waiting tables or whatever it is I have to do. But out of the middle of it came this amazing album. And I said, everybody's going to look at your pandemic and think you were one of the ones who stayed in shape and was doing it. When in fact, what you're saying is you pulled yourself out of bed and kind of got it together for the couple of weeks you needed to do it. I think you really have to be so understanding with yourself when at the height of your career, it's like being gagged forcibly physically through no will of your own. And right when you're in full cry, it's a horrible thing.
But I think too, in addition to that, and thank you for that, is this the thing of expanding and contracting, and that I feel my whole life up until 13 months ago has been in this dialogue with expanding and contracting. You go to an opera house, you work, I love everybody, the technicians, everyone. And that's part of the experience. Mm-hmm. And then I would come home and contract and be very sad anyway. So this has been another kind of expression of that experience, I think. And so I'm finding my ways to be expansive. So this is actually one of those ways. And to be able, even in this way, to spend time with you, to meet you, to have this conversation, and for me to come away feeling that I have some other tools in my toolkit now.
Can I add one last thing? Which
Please.
is, we've spoken about the relationship of this pandemic to race, to economics, to a lot of things, to community. The one thing that we haven't mentioned that I think it's important is climate. And the manner in which that the pandemic seems in many ways to be a kind of preview of what might be happening to a lot of our cultural and social expectations the next 30 to 50 years about movement and about circulation it's been for me a sobering but worthwhile thing to think about. I was the most paid up member of the Green Frequent Flyer Club you could possibly imagine in the art world. I knew everything about the troposphere and everything about my carbon emissions, and I would tell you it from the JFK Terminal 4 lounge. And I think that I was always very skeptical about various digital alternatives because, one, I knew that my individual carbon emissions were not going to make a substantial difference in the long run. And two, I believed that the sort of fostering of a better culture and a better public would lead ultimately to sort of better climate solutions in the long term. I'm not so sure about those assumptions any longer. I do think that in the same way that you don't get to go back to the way it was before, nor do you stick with what's happened since March, I think that the kind of cultural repercussions of climate change that we are all going to be facing going forward are things that we can maybe find some profitable seeds with what we've lived through over the last year, about thinking about digital and real life cultural experiences as not being so cleanly divisible, but as being somehow overlapping or somehow informing one another. I think the idea of doing things in smaller formats and in more local formats, but then absolutely getting on the plane when the time is right, is something that we should probably retain going forward. And I think that the sort of larger question of, what happens in a moment of disaster, what happens in a moment of crisis, the thing about climate is it's really slow. Right? And COVID was fast. And so, we are going to have this sort of rolling series of pressures, if not outright crises, that are going to impinge on all aspects of our lives, including culture, going forward. I'd like to hope that as we go back to normal, a terrible phrase, sort of over the
horrible
years,
phrase,
we get ready for the big one that's sort of coming in the sort of medium term. And we possibly draw from these last years a hopefully more sustainable model, not just in economic terms, but in environmental terms, of how we do culture.
What I have heard is that people have said a lot, sort of cultural leaders, that COVID has fostered a climate of discussion and that there's been a lot of outreach and discussion among different kinds of art forms, and conversations have happened that hadn't happened before. And, Helga, hearing you talk about expanding and contracting, I feel like that's kind of that learning to pull together and, what happens when you can't expand and contract in your normal sphere and how you move into other spheres that can turn into, at an institutional level, of a model of cooperation and collaboration that, again, is the Pollyanna best case scenario. I hope we never go back to normal, because I hope there will be a new normal. And I hope that the old normal, in as much as it tries to reestablish itself, will sort of have to wither and morph into other more creative, helpful directions, which, Jason, I think will speak to the concerns you raise. Given that we all know now that it can happen and we don't know how it's going to happen next, but there's a whole constellation of sort of natural disasters that are likely to befall us.
What about for you, Maya?
I mean, I think that's something that is so important. And I mean, I think we're thinking about it every day at work. And it's the kind of in terms of sustainability and climate and things like that, I mean, we're always saying that's something we should cover in every single issue of the magazine. But I think there are ways that we also, as editors and as a company, need to be conscious of that too. Writing an article about it every 2 weeks isn't really enough. And I don't really have the answers. I'm not really sure how that looks going forward. But I think it's something like how during COVID kind of infused every aspect of everyone's jobs, and it was something you thought about constantly all the day. I mean, I think similarly, climate needs to be that way too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I propose that in 6 months, it'll be November. And I think we'll know a lot more, or we will have had other kinds of experiences. And I think we should meet back here and pick up this conversation and see where we are.
It's a date.